My name is Jeff Slapp. I am the CTO and head product lead for both of our products, the InfiniVault and StrataStore products today, which we'll talk about. We're going to start off by, first off, making sure that we understand what we're talking about, which is really the outer edges of the entire end-to-end stack, if you will, right? The ingestion side as well as the storage side. But this particular presentation, just for the sake of time, is going to be focused more on the front end, on the ingestion side on the data side, and of course the InfiniVault system as acting as a Web2, Web3 gateway. We're going to go into a little bit of history because I have to say the last 2.5 years of the work that I've done here at Steeldome has been absolutely exhausting, exhilarating, and thrilling to see where this is going in the ecosystem. And we got introduced as an organization to the Filecoin universe, the Web3 universe. What was it, about January? Oh, yeah. It has 9 months, 10 months.
It feels like 10 years.
Yes, it feels much, much longer. We've learned a lot, but it was very quick when we realized that integrating everything that you have been doing for the last 7-8 years, right, in concept now into application, it made a lot of sense to extend our platform into leveraging this technology, right? And you'll see, I think, very quickly why I feel this way. So let's jump into this real quick. It might take a little more than 30 seconds, but this is supposed to be the elevator pitch. So when we talk about InfiniVault, we're actually talking about a piece of a much larger whole, right? The StrataStore platform. Now, what was interesting was when we developed this technology, we originally developed this technology to focus on data protection in light of the ransomware events that are happening all the time, right? So we had a lot of our founder, certainly, and Rich and myself, we all came from the data center world. We all came from the place where the data usually lives, and then where the customers, of course, experience that pain when they get taken out by a ransomware attack or any sort of threat like that. So we've seen those things firsthand, right? And we see the impacts to organizations and to individuals, frankly, right? Because this is stuff that impacts us people at the end of the day. So the InfiniVault piece is very simply a universal data protection system, right? It is based on a universal set of protocols on the front end, and it obfuscates the complexity of whatever's going on in the back end, right? The customer doesn't care about what the storage looks like, how it's comprised, what it's using, where it's going. Obviously, there's input from the client in terms of those things, but they don't have to be concerned with the operation of those things or even the configuration of those things. StrataStore, on the other hand, is actually designed as an enterprise-grade storage cluster in a very same way, right? Universal set of protocols. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the entire platform is software-defined, of course, and everyone here can certainly appreciate that. The power of software means that we can run this technology anywhere, right? Any private, any public cloud, any set of bare metal machines, and use any storage resources or even storage services, which I'll highlight that on the next slide when we get into InfiniVault. Some of the magic sauce around how that works on the back end with upstream storage providers. So they are designed to work independently, but they are also designed to work in concert with one another. So that's the what. What's the why? Well, we're just dealing with massive amounts of data today, very simply put. And the way that we solved storage problems 20 years ago, while you can still do it that way today, the scale that we're dealing with really forces us to consider a completely different way of looking at the way we do storage and storage operations and storage management. So that's really where this is. And you've seen multiple slides today already from this, but Gartner says that by 2025, we're looking at putting about 450 exabytes of brand new data on the internet every day. And of course, that's going to continue to get worse, right? Like everything does. And as we say to our clients, your data set's not shrinking unless you're going out of business. So that means that as the data sphere of the world continues to evolve, and certainly is pressured by applications such as AI and everything that's coming from that, they're going to be dropping tremendous amounts of data. And forget quantum computing; that's a whole nother mind-bending problem that we have to deal with, because you're going to have quantum storage and quantum networks and everything else to support that, because that data acquisition rate is out of just conceivability. So data explosion is what we're working around and dealing with. And then, of course, the idea is to bring simplicity to this. One of the things, if anybody knows what we do at Steeldome, it's around making the complex very simple. So both in terms of InfiniVault and StrataStore, we've worked very hard over the last 2.5 years to do this. So let's get into a little bit more detail around what InfiniVault is. So wanted to provide a little bit of graphics because I think pictures speak 1,000 words or maybe more than that. InfiniVault, like I said before, is a software-defined storage technology, and what it does we'll just jump right to when it's turned on. It looks like a common storage device, right? That is presented over those common protocols today, which, by the way, probably exists at least one, if not more, exists on every network probably on the planet, right, in some form or fashion. So very, very well understood universal-based protocols that, of course, then gets us out of the problem of having to talk about compatibility, right? We don't have to worry about the operating system, the data set, what the application is, right? We just simply have to know what is the data that's going to be stored on the vault. And then, of course, on the back end, which is really where some of the magic happens, and I'll talk about the vault in particular, but on the back end, it can be any storage or storage provider, right? So we can leverage today, and we'll take it before the Web3 world was introduced. We can connect to the Amazons, the Azures, the Googles, right? We turn them into one big hard drive, effectively. That's what the software does. And then we mount that hard drive inside of our operating system, we aggregate it inside of a storage pool, and then we treat it like a disk, like any other disk at that point. And the power of being able to mix and match, depending on your needs, and distribute and essentially shard that data across various storage and storage providers is a very powerful capability. Now, there's a lot of use cases here. We could spend probably an hour just on basic use cases. I mentioned a couple of them here in the slides, but you could see that the combination of storage providers and or even localized storage inside the data center, because customers have plenty of localized storage that's unused. That can all be aggregated and made to look uniform. And that's really what software-defined storage is, right, at the end of the day. If you go back to the earlier days of SDS, I call it, we're like in SDS version 2 now, version 2 era with what we're doing. But the ability to have control of that and the mobility of that is very, very powerful. So the vault in and of itself is deployed in most times, is deployed as a virtual machine, okay? Just because of its nature and the convenience of being able to deploy as a virtual machine. As opposed to StrataStore, which can also run as a virtual machine, but because of its nature is more likely to be deployed as a physical machine, because that actually is going to be replacing off-the-shelf commercial-grade storage platforms typically. So just a slightly different use case and a different deployment model. But again, all software at the end of the day. When we deploy a vault for using cloud-backed storage, which is to say, S3, and not necessarily Amazon, right? There's plenty of S3 providers out there, but any S3 provider, we turn those buckets into hard drives and then consume the storage, like I said before. We intentionally limit the size of the vault to 100 terabytes because from a practicality perspective, right, when you're talking about capacity versus available bandwidth, there generally has to be some parity there. You have to be a little bit conscious of that. You wouldn't want to stand up a vault, even though it technically would work. It might not work well if you stand up a 100 terabyte vault and you only have a 100 meg circuit to the internet, right? Again, will it work? We have customers that run on 100 megs, but they don't have 100 terabytes of storage. They might have 5, right, as an example. So you have to be cognizant of that. So usually that's always the case, though. We haven't found too many instances where there's a massive amount of data and a very inadequate amount of bandwidth, right? They're usually in lockstep to some extent. Most times today, our customers are running easily 1 gig or 10 gig, very commonly. But if you go beyond that, if you go to local storage, then at that point you can use petabytes of internal capacity, right? We'll aggregate everything in your entire environment if you want under a single machine, and that's not a problem at all. So kind of the life cycle here as we go through this, and this is where I'm going to tie the Web3 component into this, because our evolution, of course, now that you understand the history, you'll see why it's easy for us to extend into Web3. So any data set coming from the left being deposited over those common protocols, one or all, or whatever combination that you want. Once the data reaches the vault, everything is being done in real time, or as close to real time as possible. As it's being translated out through to the storage or the storage provider. So obviously we're talking about distribution. We distribute the data across, again, whatever the combination of back-end storage or storage providers. All data, both in the reads and writes, are all checksummed, right? You have to provide that data integrity because at the end of the day, when you look at the original intent of the vault, It was to store data for data protection purposes to be retrieved in the event of data loss or an attack or something like that. Well, no one cares that you back the data up. They only care if you can restore the data. So obviously having additional data integrity on top of what's already present either with the storage system that we're writing it to or the cloud provider that we're writing it to, which they all have their various SLAs around that. This is in addition to that, because I don't think you can have too much integrity guarantees. Optimizing it, right? We do inline dedupe and compression, again, toggleable. Compression is usually optimal in every case. Dedupe, that's case by case, but again, that can be turned on and off as necessary. And of course, immutability. Now, this is where we get into some interesting conversations. The industry does throw this word around quite a bit. I'm going to define it the way we see it. Immutability is not just simply having snapshots. Right, and that was almost like back in the day when cloud came onto the scene, where everyone was confused as to what cloud was because it wasn't just one thing. It was software as a service, it was infrastructure as a service, it was platform as a service, and that's why there was so much confusion, because everyone would just throw the word cloud out there, and everyone just thought, aren't we all talking the same thing? And it's really not. It's very different. It's much, much bigger. So immutability is almost in that same type of category, where you have snapshots, yes, and that's been around for decades, right? Since the very early storage systems. That's nothing new. The immutability that we're talking about is, yes, the data within the snapshots have to be immutable or unchangeable, but the snapshots themselves also have to be immutable and unchangeable, because if you don't have that, then there's nothing to talk about. This is primarily one of the attack vectors that ransomware attackers and threat actors will use, is that they will either break in and circumvent those protections, or they have someone on the inside, an insider threat, someone who already has full access and administrative control of the system, because that's their job. They become compromised, and therefore they're able to compromise the mechanism here and allow the attack to be successful, because now I've destroyed the ability to recover. So immutability, we actually control that level of immutability. It's a form of safe mode. So not even the customer has the ability to do destructive functions on the vault, because they simply don't have access to it. Only Steeldome personnel has access to it. Now, I say that by default because that it can be overridden if a client decides to sign a waiver taking us out of the chain of responsibility. They can do that. But by default, which is why they're coming to us in the first place, is to provide that true immutability to that data set. So how do we now tie in the Web3 world? Well, today, most of the storage providers that we work with, and of course this will change over time as the ecosystem evolves, but at least the providers that we've worked with so far, which is about maybe 5 or 6 different ones, either present some form of S3 endpoint or an SSH type connection, both of which we turn into a file system mount point within our operating system. And when we do that, it looks like a folder just like any other folder, which is very convenient, because when you access the vault over SMB, if you're on a Windows machine and you open up your Windows Explorer and you see all your folders, you now see a new folder called Storage Provider A, right? And that would have a direct connection to their S3 bucket, which would allow the transfer of data to the S3 world, and of course the ingestion and then the downstream process that takes place after that. We do the same thing with SSH as well. It's a very common method, but we mount that as a file system. And that, again, makes it, from the customer's perspective, they're not concerned about the complexities and the nuts and bolts of what's going on inside the engine. All they know is they see a new folder. I know where that folder goes when I send data to it. And that process of moving data back and forth between their world and the Web3 world can be an automated process. And again, it's usually in the direction of Web3 because of the generally non-transactional nature of Web3, at least as it is today, where they can either manually move data or they can have a scheduler move the data for them. Say after 6 months if a file hasn't been accessed or a folder hasn't been accessed, the system will recognize that, will pick that up and actually move that over to that particular folder, which is Web3 bound. So again, just some basic use cases here, because again, we could spend all day talking about these, but one of the most common use cases is, again, like I mentioned, we're talking about protecting Veeam or Commvault or any whatever backup method that the client happens to be using. It makes no difference, because at the end of the day, when you look at backup systems, they all package up the data, but they have to deposit the data somewhere, right? Well, now that somewhere becomes a storage target, such as InfiniVault. Now, in some cases, we may not be the primary. Sometimes we are, but sometimes, actually, I would say majority of the time, because now companies are dealing with having very difficult time getting cybersecurity insurance, right? Getting that underwriting, they have to show that their backup methods and their recovery methods are much, much better than what they were, say, a year ago or when they were first underwritten. And what happens now is we become a secondary target a lot of times to that already existing primary target, which may be just storage in their data center. Except that now when that data hits the vault, again, it goes through the process of being distributed out to the, the various cloud providers or whatever storage endpoint that you've set it up with. And then there's a couple of things we can do with it, which is actually very interesting. The first one is we can do incrementally replicated archives, if you will, of the entire storage pool to a location. So let's say, for instance, that an administrator decided that, okay, we just deposited 10 terabytes of brand new data onto the vault, and we need to ensure that this data persists forever, as an example. They can choose now to enable the pool snapshot capability, and this is a different snapshot capability. I'm talking about this is a macroscopic view of the pool now. We literally package up the entire storage pool, right? All of the data, all the metadata, the encryption, the checksum, the deduplication tables, everything in mass, and into a single monolithic file, and then deposit that over to, in this case, a Web3 storage provider connection for safekeeping and archiving. The other method is where clients are using, let's say they're using an InfiniVault with local storage, which again is very common, and they want to have, again, that incremental snapshot replication to another vault somewhere else. We can do one-to-one, many-to-many, any combination of. And of course, those vaults can all have their own independent storage configurations as well, right? It can be something completely different because it's being done at a storage pool level. The underlying hardware or the service is irrelevant to the software. It doesn't care. As long as it sees a disk, that's all that matters. So those are the two common protocols, or use cases that we typically find ourselves in. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the insurance use case? Because that's like, the ransomware.
Sure.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah.
I think it would be good to understand better we talked about it, right? The end-to-end flow and where we can drive value with the proofs.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. And Rich, obviously you can add as necessary, but we're working with some pretty large international organizations at this point that are in charge of, I think they're actually able to do both. They not only provide the data protection services such as InfiniVault, but they also do the insurance side of it. So they have responsibility of the whole chain. And this is particularly interesting in the ransomware world because there's many methods that the attackers use in order to disrupt a data set. They're not all just blatant, flat out delete or encrypt, right? There's very subtle ways that they can insert errors or corruptions into streams that can largely go undetected a lot of times. And then by the time you realize it, it's too late. And when you go to recover, well, the data's trashed, right? And obviously in this particular case, at the end of the day, we're not responsible for the data that we receive. The customer has to determine the data that's received. So if we're receiving trash, then we're going to give them back trash, right? There's nothing we can do about it because we don't have insight into anything else prior to that upstream. So you have to assume a level of trust from the data source to us. But once the data source gets to us, that's when all these mechanisms kick in, and obviously the ability to offload to Web3 adds a whole nother, it's a game-changing capability now to this space, right? When we're talking about the verifiability, the continual verifiability, that when I give you the data today, that 3, 4, 5 years from now, I can still retrieve exactly that data, guaranteed, because it's constantly verified. There's no other system on the planet that I know that does that.
Yeah, let me add something to that. To bring it up a level or two, because depending on the persona or whether an organization's been breached or not, or whether it's preventive, kind of changes the scenario a little bit, right? So within the NIST framework, we're not doing everything, right? We're doing the safeguarding, the data protection, the data recovery services. But we are partnered with some of the largest cybersecurity consultancies that are doing a lot of that vulnerability, rebuilding, all of the everything else in this framework, for lack of a better description, to recover an organization, whether it be technically or organizationally, what process, et cetera. In those scenarios, what we're learning is there's a need for a third-party alternative to not only solve the immediate problem, but to safeguard the data going forward And so there's I'll keep it simple, a secondary partner from a technology standpoint that we are working with, all of this running under the Stratastore platform. For all of the other ransomware protection services we don't do, for example, endpoint, MDR, et cetera. Right now, Stefan, to be specific around your question, we're working with the cybersecurity insurance companies, and we've done a lot of research with the CX level folks, if you will. In those discussions, they just simply have no control over the data, the workloads, the data flows, or how they've been attacked. So what we're doing is, where Jeff was saying, the insurance companies, they just simply wrote deals and have not necessarily validated or authenticated how organizations would recover. That is no longer the case. A few years ago, we were kind of getting away with it, if you will, as an industry. But what's happened now is they're tightening the screws because they're writing multi-million-dollar checks. MGM being one of the most recent ones that were just put out there, right? Why did Caesars pay the ransom and MGM didn't? MGM has pretty good insurance, right? So what's going to happen in that scenario, and again, I'm speaking generically, I have no inside knowledge on this or anything of that nature, but what's going to happen is MGM's going to have to be able to recover or produce that type of information going forward from that insurance organization. As an example, I'm being very generic. So what we're putting out there is we can't think of a better solution from an archive perspective that blockchain's your answer from a technology standpoint. Filecoin's your answer from a crypto perspective, right? So a utility perspective. So if we now offer that end-to-end solution where we're out there giving organizations, working with the organizations beyond our pay grade, right, doing the consultancies, but now there's a flip of the switch, if you will, to the third party. Well, that third party is Steeldome, right? What does that mean? Jeff's gone through the presentation as far as how we're doing our thing from encryption. We would love to add the blockchain, the Filecoin piece to that story and take all of the advantages of what that brings to the table from an audit, non-tampering perspective. We think it's a game changer, but there's a lot more. We can talk about this topic in quite some detail, but ransomware prevention, I think, is the best use case for cold storage right now with Filecoin.
You haven't started marketing this yet, but what do you intend to market with regards to number of copies that are actually in archive? Because it's one thing to say, we've got a copy on blockchain. It's another to say, oh, and it's highly decentralized and there are 5.
That's right.
Because I would imagine you're in a world where you can charge for like any number of copies. Like we kind of are bimodal, it's 1 or 5.
I'm going to hedge and say TBD, but I will say it generically that this is a total cost of ownership and an investment protection discussion. It's not what your price per TIB is or your price per PIB. Right. So these organizations it's under risk management, obviously. So the organizations are coming to organizations like ours looking for some leadership around how many copies do I need to store? Is it 3 copies on Filecoin, 1 unsealed for now because of file recovery? Or are we not putting all of our data yet on Filecoin because we still have, I mean, let's face it, if somebody wants to move PIBs of data around, there's a migration from their existing infrastructure providers that they still need. So there is a path to providing multiple copies in different formats in both, I'll say, distributed and decentralized environment.
But you also have inline erasure coding.
That's right.
So you don't need multiple copies.
Correct. Yep. But again, not to be wishy-washy with it. These are case by case, vertical by vertical. I heard Angelo mention GDPR. Depending on where the data is around the world is a different set of requirements from the recovery process and the regulations that need to be aligned. You know, that holds true whether we're talking about healthcare or anything else.
And say we asked Seal to like step up and help us, do some discovery work on the legal hold side. Can you take the lead on doing discovery for ransomware and participate in our working group?
Would love to.
Wow. So yeah, lots to talk about there for sure. And with the time that we've got left, the last thing I'm going to say here is that, as you could already see, we talked about it. This can facilitate data going directly into Web3, or it can also facilitate the bridges, or sometimes as we're referred to as a gateway, from the Web2 to the Web3 world, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there to, a very, very easy opportunity to transition data to the Web3 world. I'm going to mention Stratostore here. It's not, just so you're aware, because there is some relevancy to this. Again, this is not the focus of this particular session, but it was interesting. Again, around this, when the time when we got introduced to the Web3 community, we very quickly realized that while we've got multiple intersection points here, InfiniVault very clearly on the front end, but now Stratostore on the back end. And we didn't even know this going in. This was actually, I think, came out of our first ESPA where there was a major light bulb moment for us. When you look, obviously, anyone who's running a storage provider, and certainly everyone who knows the technology knows that the storage providers have to bring some pretty robust gear, right? I mean, this is not in the ether. This is actually has to land on real infrastructure. And I know when I operated in the data center world, when we would run infrastructure, we all had to deal with the same thing that I suspect most, even Web2 and certainly Web3 providers do today, which is after a certain period of time, there has to be, you're dealing with a life cycle of hardware, right? And picking up, 10 petabytes or 100 petabytes of data and migrating it to a new platform is probably not one of the things that's on the list of wanna-dos for the infrastructure team, right? That's almost a nightmare, and that's going to continue to get worse, right? As this world continues to generate more and more data, that's going to be a practically impossible task. So, again, this is going back to my earlier statements around we have to rethink about how we're doing storage today. And again, software version 2.0, software-defined storage 2.0, is really where we feel this will have a major impact. Stratostore, again, Stratostore proper now in terms of an actual product, not the platform, but the product, the back end of the system. This is what it looks like. Now I show hardware here because it is typically deployed on hardware, but don't let that fool you. It's software, it can run anywhere. We run this on virtual clusters, we run it in the public cloud, it doesn't make any difference. But the point here is that it's abstracting the data, which is the Web3 data, right, the Filecoin data, away from the hardware. So now instead of having to deal with the typical rip and replace cycles that anybody that's been in IT long enough knows, right, they're going to face at some point. And enterprises face it continuously. They're constantly ripping and replacing and migrating and moving all this data around. That's a very, very time-consuming and very dangerous operation. It's very risky to the data itself. This is a rolling life cycle, meaning there is no end to this life cycle, right? This is in as long as you want it to be. Because whether you're expanding the system from a capacity perspective vertically, from a node perspective, or horizontally from a node perspective, right? Capacity or bandwidth, in other words, you can do that on the fly, right? And so this solves a lot of problems for storage providers or storage providers that want to be Web3 storage providers, because now essentially what you're doing is we're taking all of the last 20 years worth of expertise and software development and clustering technologies, the same technologies that frankly Amazon uses for their massive scale system today, and now democratizing it and making it available for everybody. Because this system, one of the primary reasons why clients would not deploy a system like this is because it's just too darn complex. Most would be like, I don't want to deal with this. Well, we can deploy Stratostore clusters of any size in about 20 to 25 minutes. But it gets even better than that. Besides the fact that they can go from bare metal to a fully operational system that quickly without having brain damage and a massive headache, now you can add on top of that additional hyper-converged capabilities in the form of containers and virtual machines, which is where some of your Lotus components can run, or any of the supported Filecoin protocol stack components that you would need to run directly on the hardware. Yeah.
So do you see this working with sort of traditional storage, even if they're upgrading within their own systems, or is it more system to system, like you're pulling out Hitachi and you're putting in EMC?
It would, well, what's interesting, and again, not talking bad about any one vendor, but it definitely gets you away from the standard off-the-shelf commercial vendors, right? If a lot of the conversations I've had with the storage providers, the Web3 storage providers, is that they tend to build their own because of the cost effectiveness, right? I pick the disk, I pick the servers, I run whatever file system I want, and I control it. Now, they assume a lot of responsibility. That's where a lot of the savings is. But what we're saying is that yes, continue to do that. You really need to do that if you're going to, in order to deal with the economies of scale, you kind of have to do that, right? But now we're saying if you're doing it, there's a very compelling reason why you want to go a clustered route, because now the underlying hardware and the composition and the lifespan of it is irrelevant. I don't care if it's 10 petabytes or an exabyte. It makes no difference. As I continue to expand, I just continue to expand incrementally on the nodes or the capacity of those nodes. And as they become end of life, which everything hardware-wise eventually does, you just introduce new nodes, you decommission the old nodes. And the nature of the system is to move the data. The data is not tied to any piece of hardware. It's all completely fluid, which, again, for those that have been in software-defined storage, it's like, yeah, of course that's what it is. But now we're doing it at a clustered level. We're not talking about it at an individual drive, array, or a storage device level. We're talking about system-wide data fluid motion across the entire platform. So whether you're running Supermicro or HP or Dell or Lenovo or something completely different, it doesn't matter. You could have one vendor today, another vendor tomorrow, a different mix of hard drives. It makes no difference what the underlying hardware is. But the point is that you have the resiliency, the redundancy, and of course the flexibility of the data not being tied to that hardware, which in a storage provider world, when you're dealing with PIBs of data, you don't want to be forklifting data and moving stuff around any more than you have to, right? Yeah, please.
I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, we're right there.
I want to give one quick use case because I think it'll clear it up, what we're seeing. It's a hybrid environment, runs on-prem or off-prem. We can go down that ransomware route again, but what organizations are doing is consolidating and not wanting to put the capital outlay on the infrastructure they have. So we're seeing setting up the Stratostore environment on-prem, maybe as an alternate archive solution for cloud providers, or in this case, a Filecoin solution, and consolidating NAS and SAN environments really, really quickly. Yep. Taking that alternate, that second copy or that overpriced copy that's on a hyperscaler today and getting it off that prem. So it nets out to a faster migration at the end of the day.
Yeah. And it also helps to enable storage providers to come online quicker, which I think the network would appreciate, right? So I'll give you a quick personal example. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, up to speed on all the pieces of Lotus and all the different components, but I knew enough to be able to deploy the stack, right? So within 45 minutes or so, I had a fully operational Stratostore cluster running with the entire stack as far as I knew. I had the web interface up. It was telling me everything was running properly. So I'll take that, right? Within under an hour, I had the entire system operational. Now, if you were to ask a storage provider today how long it took them to go operational, it's probably a little longer than 45 minutes. Now, of course, that's assuming that you have the hardware in play. You got to have the hardware. But the technology that you're laying on top of that to prepare that hardware for its use is equally as important. That's what we're talking about. We're, again, going back to that word democratization, right? That's what we're trying to do here, is trying to make it available to more people with less brain damage, less pain, so that they can get on to doing the business of what we're doing here. And that's what we're all about. So,
So you could
yeah.
build a Filecoin node as part of your stack for enterprises on-prem to participate in a decentralized.
Sure. Sure. Now again, when you say a Filecoin, no, make sure I have the terminology right. The technology stack, the logic that needs to reside so that it can talk to the Filecoin network and advertise as a storage provider, right? Is that, and this is an ignorance question, so I apologize, is Lotus as a part of that, or that is Lotus?
Yeah, there's multiple, like Lotus.
Okay.
Lotus Active, Lotus Core.
Okay, so because Lotus, at least in, well, the way that I did it was I just deployed it. When we deploy Stratostore, you have the ability to turn on our Docker Swarm cluster, right? So we just spun up that stack inside of Docker, and it just continued to run across those Stratostore nodes. You could do that inside of VMs too, right? We run the latest. This one we actually run a real-time preemptive kernel for this system because of the nature of what it does. But all of our kernels are custom built. But this one we actually run the latest versions of KVM, right? 8.1.2 or whatever they're on right now, and then of course the latest versions of Docker and Docker Swarm. So you have high availability across all those protocols and all those layers. Now we're not saying you should do that. We're just saying if you want to do that, you can run hyper-converged because there's a benefit of having the application that close to the storage, right? And since the application is storage related, it makes sense. But you can certainly have those components separate as well, right? Because again, we're just presenting standard protocols out to the network. So if you wanted to come in through a protocol way, iSCSI, NVMe over Fabrics, whatever, you could do that. And I will also mention, because I'm kind of proud of it, it's not something that you see all that often, and for good reason. It took quite a bit of work to integrate this, but we actually do support clustered SMB. That's not something you normally see. So you have to do some pretty custom builds to make that work properly. So, but yeah, so that's the system as it is today. And again, InfiniVault and Stratastore together form the Stratastore platform. And they are designed to work together, as you can see, because we advertise the same protocols that InfiniVault is expecting as a storage system. So that's all I got for you guys. If there are any other questions at all, yeah, I want to be careful of time. We're 5 over, so if there's anything else, we can certainly track me down. Rich, yeah, perfect. Thank you.